heard a lot of them over the last few days around education and job growth and et cetera. But when we think about our older communities, how are you seeing, what are some of the demographic and what are some of the other trends that we need to consider in terms of preparing for growth and prosperity in our older communities? So why don't we start with you, Mark?
Thank you, Todd, and thanks, Philly Fed, for the opportunity to be here this morning. I appreciate it. Well, I think the outlook for our older communities is really a tale of two cities. I think larger cities that are more globally oriented, lots of amenities, they'll do well. Smaller cities that are more regionally focused, don't have those kinds of amenities, their prospects are much poorer. So if you take Pennsylvania as your case study, that would immediately imply that Philadelphia, which is a population of 4 million, lots of amenities, relatively globally oriented. Pittsburgh, 2.5 million. Prospects, I think, are very good. I think growth will be as strong as we really want it to be. The only limitation on growth, I think, is our own imagination and our ability to organize ourselves in an efficient way, which, Philadelphia's got. I just know Philadelphia better because I live here. We're not as well organized as many other communities across the country. And then smaller communities like, Allentown, Altoona, Johnstown, Reading, Erie. These are economies of 100,000 to 300,000, 400,000 people. I think they've got a problem. It's going to be very difficult. I think one of the key trends, in addition to the ongoing globalization of the economy, when I say globalization, I mean that in a sort of a broader context. So that would include not only trade, but foreign immigration, investment, foreign investment, all very important. But one of the other key trends that I think will influence this tale of two cities is demographic. And really the most important demographic from a macroeconomic perspective, I think, is the age distribution of the population. Here's the most important statistic of the day. It's my age. Anyone want to guess how old I am? Oh, you're so kind. Yeah. I once upon a time I had hair and I did have muscles, believe it or not. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. You look great. I am 54 years old. I represent the largest single-year age group in the country. There are more of me than any other age. And abstracting from the 55 and 53-year-olds, that's the teeth of the baby boom generation. Oh, here's another question. What is, abstracting from that sort of the folks that are around me, what is the second largest single-year age group in the country? Who said 11?
No.
That's wrong.
23.
Yeah. Jeremy knows the answer, but he's not allowed to answer. Yes. Yeah. Anyone know? Okay. My firstborn, 22 years old, right? 22 years old. So the next 10, all you have to do to know what's going to happen in the economy, really, is train a camera on me and my family. I need a reality TV show because, and
we have one in Atlanta.
Yeah, and I'm going to, and my demographic is going from mid-50s to mid-60s to 70, and my kid is going to go from early 20s to early 30s and mid-30s, and that has important implications, right, for all kinds of things. But to me, that is an enormous opportunity for older communities who can take advantage of that. So universities, educational services, healthcare. Does this sound familiar? I mean, this is Philadelphia. This is Pittsburgh. We should have a very powerful demographic tailwind over the next 10, 15 years, and we should take advantage of it. And conversely, what does that mean for the smaller communities? They're going to lose their people, right? The older people are going to go to Florida or Texas or just age, and the younger people are going to leave. So this is a very powerful dynamic. Now, there's things we can do to try to address this, and in the case of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, foster the growth. So we should be focused on our universities, on our institutions, on enhancing these forces that will benefit from the demographic tailwinds. But if I were in a smaller community, I think I would be focused on is I'd be identifying the asset, and in most cases it's one asset, it may be two, that makes this economy tick, and I'd be focused on that like a laser beam and trying to figure out how to enhance the returns. And for the bigger cities, it's not about focusing on any particular asset. It's just making sure the infrastructure is good, making sure the educational system is good, worrying about the broader infrastructure that makes a city economy tick, but not focus on any individual asset.
Thank you. Susan, what are your thoughts around the future?
Well, first of all, it wasn't Yogi Berra, the great philosopher, who said it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So, and I thought I was going to follow Mark, who makes predictions about the future as part of his day job, and say, we've got the answer, now let's skip to Jeremy and find out how to implement it, because Jeremy's the master of implementation. And Mark is the master of the prediction. In fact, when I need to know the data, I call Mark. But I find myself totally, bewildered and nonplussed, because guess what? For I think the very first time in our lives together, by the way, long time here, I disagree. So absolutely I agree, and this is what I was going to say, that cities are coming back. That's in the data. Cities are coming back. And it's not about a prediction, because prediction for 20, 30 years is something I cannot do. It's in the data. For the first time in the history of the data, cities are growing faster than the suburbs. And if that does all suburbs, total suburbs, including the far-flung suburbs, the average of suburbs. And if that's not astounding, it should be, because the most recent decade data confirms all the decades up to recently, suburbs are growing 3 times as fast as cities. Now, it's not reversed. It's not that we've got 3 times as fast in the cities. That would be impossible. But cities are growing faster than suburbs. So number one, and what size cities? I don't know, we've got to, I don't know, maybe we should go to the library or go to the internet. All size cities. I mean, Allentown, Bethlehem, they're growing in the past decade at 12%. Gray from Lancaster, I believe Lancaster's growing. Cities of all size are growing. We just have a book from our Fed conference 2 years ago, Revitalizing American Cities, and it's about small and mid-sized cities. Now, I'm not disagreeing that the wins are much more in the backs of the superstar cities. And that's not even, sorry to say it, folks, not Philadelphia. It's London. It's Tokyo. New York, San Francisco, the superstar cities, I'm totally with you. But it's actually density is coming back. Centrality is coming back. And in part of it's technology, and part of it's self-reinforcing that we've rediscovered the benefits of density clusters. And in this internet age, it seems like a total reversal and irony, because the internet means frictions of distance gone. But actually, it's the reverse, because the internet means everything is commodified that can be commodified. And what cannot be commodified is in-person interaction and creativity. And that's what cities bring us, even cities as small as Lancaster, where they've got a great art scene, I understand, going on.
Jeremy, what are your thoughts around, and I don't know if you want to weigh in here into this debate, but what are your thoughts on it?
I didn't expect to have the Yogi Berra quote, but I was thinking his favorite quote when asked what time it was, he said, right now. So I thought I'd go with that. So I think, let me weigh in on this, because I think I agree, and yet I think there's some texture here which is really important. The numbers Mark used were regional numbers as opposed to the central city numbers. I think he would agree. I think Susan's right, although I think you would agree there are some types of cities that are growing absolutely different. I think if you look in a textured way in a city like this one, the growth is quite fragile, and the question is, as Mark and Susan would agree, I'm sure, what will enable it in the future and what will not. So If I looked at the last 10 years census and even numbers from the American Community Survey since then, I would say that if you break down, Philadelphia had a slight growth, right? And after losing 500,000 people over 50 years, it had 1.5% growth. So we put banners all over the streets, which was terrific. And then the question was, what does that mean? And then if you look at the age numbers, if you look at the age cohorts, it turns out that we had a dramatic loss in people from 5 to 17, and we had a dramatic gain, people from 23 to 34. And in fact, we still had significant losses in people from 35 to 55, which is a prime earning age. So in fact, it turns out that we're gaining, but we're largely gaining, there's nothing wrong with this, by swiping out one group for another. And so the question is that a sustainable growth trajectory for the city? It may very well be. But we clearly we have a different kind of a middle class in terms of household composition than we did 20 or 30 years ago. We have more people without kids who are in that middle class. But the middle class with kids with children are still leaving the city if they cannot privatize goods, certain public goods, or if they can't work their way through public education system in a way that works for their family. So we still see here that there are limitations to this growth. And then when you do surveys with those 23 to 34-year-olds and ask them, are they going to stick around? I mean, you know, I have a kid that age, so I don't know what good a survey means when you ask my kid what he's going to do in 10 years, but let alone 6 months. But if you ask them, a surprising number of people say if you don't fix the schools, we're likely not going to. And so perhaps that won't matter. Perhaps we'll keep having this population transfer in and out, which is fine. It's a healthy region, and that's okay. But for central cities, there still is this question: are there core public goods that have got to be better, and have to be at a stronger, more middle-class quality, in order to do two things: attract and retain a middle class, but I would say just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, to be the accelerators for social mobility for low-income people. And if you can't do that, I think that growth, yes, but growth of a particular way, and I'd say that we're in a kind of an experiment right now about how sustainable that growth will be. And my guess would be that for certain cities, given the nature of their economy, that'll be quite sustainable. And for other cities, they're going to run out of drag in that. Okay. And then the other thing I would say is that for 20 or 30 years, we've had the eds and meds conversation, and for all the reasons that Mark said, but I would say that eds and meds in many places, I'd say it's not your grandfather or your grandmother's eds and meds anymore. The volatility in higher education is such that we don't know what it will look like in 20 years from now. We have 4,000 four-year colleges. We don't know. So if you've got a Harvard or a Penn, you're in good shape. If you've got the Cleveland Clinic, you're likely in good shape. But we don't know. There's disruptions. The idea that there won't be disruptions in these institutions of place the way there are in every other industry is not something I would bank on. So I would say that there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of churn here. So while I agree overall, I'd say what's important for political leaders or civic leaders is to have a nuanced understanding of the churn and then to do the right things accordingly.
Okay, so that actually leads me to a question for you, Mark, and this has to do with when we think about jobs. So of course we all know that jobs are it's the base of the pyramid when we think about community development. It's hard to talk about affordable housing if you don't talk about a person doesn't have a job, or it's hard to talk about asset building. And we've seen a trend in many of our older cities of this hollowing middle class, where we have some of the services, accounting and et cetera, are lawyers, and some of these eds and meds where people are earning lots of money, but then we also see people who are earning very little. And so the erosion of these middle class jobs has been a trend that we've seen. So it would strike me that in order for a lot of our older cities to be competitive, but to also achieve a lot of the what we would expect in a healthy economy, we need to see these middle jobs. So can you talk a little bit about what you are seeing and how you expect, if you think that that's a trend, or what are the types of things we'll need to do in order to reverse that?
Yeah, I think the hollowing out of middle-paying jobs is a trend. Yes, I think there's a what I'd call a cyclical component to it, meaning it's part of the tough economy we've been in, and a structural component, something that is more permanent. The cyclical component is been driven by the sharp decline in jobs in government. So if you look at state and local government employment, it's down 750, 800,000 jobs from where it was 4 or 5 years ago. All those jobs, or almost all of those jobs, are middle-income jobs. Teachers, emergency responders. You can go down the list. And anything housing related, and there's a lot of jobs that are tied into the housing construction cycle, and it's everything from building a home to the trucker that moves the stuff around to the cable hookup, all the jobs related. That obviously has been crushed in the housing downturn until very recently. That cyclical dimension to the problem of middle-class jobs is now reversing. So state and local governments have gotten their, reasonably gotten their act together. A lot of big problems, but for the near term. So we're starting to see some job growth there. And obviously the housing cycle is starting to turn and will turn. So this cyclical component of the problem for the middle class is starting to reverse itself. And I think we'll go from a big negative to a positive, and a big positive a year or two down the road. But there is a structural component to it, and there's actually some really good work done. I can't remember the name of the paper, but I highly recommend it to Frank Levy, MIT professor, who has done a very nice job of lining up occupations by pay scale and looking at all the various technologies that influence those occupations. And immediately what you see is those occupations at the bottom of the pay scale, they'll be okay, there'll be no problem. You can't, they're menial jobs. It's very difficult to write computer code to eliminate those jobs, at least so far. I know University of Pennsylvania is working on, they've got a soccer team apparently, and if they figure out how to play soccer with robots, then we're all doomed. Barring that, low-end jobs okay. High-end jobs, this is great. I'm writing the computer code, I'm building the models, I'm building the soccer team. But you look in the middle, they're going to get crushed, right? I mean, they're going to code it out, essentially. And so this is a long-running secular dynamic. And those people in the middle, they go in one of two directions. Either they go up or they go down the pay scale. And unless we educate, retrain, focus on how to enhance their skill set, they're going down.
So what are the implications for the older cities? So how are they, what can they do to begin to address this as we think in the future?
Well, my sense is it's all about workforce development, right? It's all about making sure that those people who are getting coded out have an opportunity to develop the skills necessary to move up as opposed to move down. Now that's obviously a tricky thing to do on lots of levels. Who's going to pay for it, and just the management and execution on all of this. And I think one of the things I've observed that I think we should be really focused on in terms of enhancing workforce development is partnerships between businesses, universities, and government. So you've got case studies. One really good one is Siemens, the big German engineering manufacturing firm, has teamed up with Duke Energy, which is the big electric utility. Duke.
Yep.
They're big. Yeah, and they're the biggest in Southern Company in Atlanta, and NC State. And Siemens will provide resources to NC State, labs and pay for teachers. The quid pro quo, they have input into the curriculum process, right? Now you have to be careful about intellectual freedom, and I'm very sensitive to that. My father's a professor, and I understand that. But at the end of the day, you're going to get kids coming out of that school that can go right into the factory to produce the turbine that's going to go to Duke to the next, energy efficient electric utility plant. So those and that I think that process can be supercharged if we get a little bit of government help and support. Then I think we're off and running. And that's the kind of public-private partnership I think we need to try to develop to enhance the workforce so that when people get coded out, and they will get coded out, they go up instead of they go down.
Okay. So Susan, I want to talk to you a little bit about this issue.
And by the way, can I say,
yeah.
I never disagree with Susan. I never.
And I don't disagree with Mark.
And I have to say, I don't think I disagree with her, actually. So if you want to come back to that at some point.
Yeah,
I'd be happy.
and I actually think that it's a metro area, probably.
Yeah, I
We're
think
talking
that's
about
probably,
metro areas,
right. It must be.
Yeah, and we need to, the problem is getting the data on these small-sized cities should be done in a consistent way.
So I want to turn to this issue around affordable housing, and certainly over the last several decades, we saw the emergence of a number of policies and programs to help to support the development of affordable housing, less so over the last decade. And so I'm curious about your thoughts of the future as we think about a lot of the tools or strategies have been proven to be successful or not so much. So for example, issues around what are going to be the implications around our regulatory framework from QM, and what if GSC reform, stillborn as it is, as well as some of these models around land banks and shared equity. So I'm curious about what do you see as the future trends around affordable housing, and specifically around what can we expect around GSC reform and how that will shape our affordable housing future?
Well, that's a small issue, GSE reform. But do we have an hour?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. And by the way, I think it's tomorrow that the vote on GSE reform is occurring. And just on that, on the bill, it's actually an important improvement over, and a lot of hard work from folks like Mark and others in the room to move that bill forward. It's got bipartisan, and that's incredible, but it's going to die. I'm sad to say, but it's moved forward. So where does that leave us, and where does that leave us to your basic question of what's out there for affordable housing? Because if what we say is the case, that in fact cities like Philadelphia are no longer declining, and they are growing, it's going to be reflected in pricing. It's going to be reflected, and it's that kind of, once growth really turns around, when it's clear it's turning around, that can be pretty dramatic. We can see neighborhoods go from affordable to not affordable pretty quickly. So that, of course, the two themes that I think we're looking at, revitalizing communities and affordability, they're opposites. So we revitalize, we're successful, and then we need affordable housing. And add to that Mark's numbers and perspective on wages and the hollowing out of the middle income group. Clearly we're going to have pressures going forward. And by the way, we've seen it already. Home ownership rates, which peaked at 69%. By the way, the crisis in this, the crisis of the subprime crisis, the huge blowout of subprime, was in the years 2004 to 2007. Does anybody know, you want to guess, what was the year of maximum home ownership in the United States? I will ask for hands. How many people say the height of home ownership is 2007? 2006? 2005? 2004? Well, actually, you know, it's early in the morning, whatever. The answer is 2004. So the subprime crisis, the blowout, the huge increase in debt was not about home ownership. It was about leverage. It was about investment housing. It was about speculation. It was not about home ownership, which peaked in 2004 at 69%. Now, home ownership is down to 64% and falling. So, and especially, of course, among the communities which are most historically pressed for home ownership, the young, where it's gone from 50% to 43%, middle, not so young, through 30s, young as far as concerned. But these people who would normally be able to start building equity in a starter home, first-time home ownership is at the lowest rate as a percentage of sales in the numbers ever. It's only 23%. So we've got a crisis right now in affordable housing for home ownership. Now, of course, rental is equally important. And we've got not a crisis, but we've got a long-term brewing problem there because rental housing rents are going up. They're going up, of course, in revitalizing cities, but they're going up. They're just increasing across the board. And this is not only cyclical, this is secular. If you go back to the 1990s, you see a shift in the data where rents historically in the US have kept pace with inflation, but they're actually increasing faster than inflation. Not a lot faster, but in a world where semi-skilled, low-skilled jobs, and now the hollowing out the middle-income jobs, means that wages are not going up. That's a problem. So what do we have? Well, for one, we have home ownership. I am not pessimistic, actually. I am optimistic that we will be able to come back to really a system that worked. We had 20 years in this country, economists call it the Great Moderation, from 1980 to 2000, where we build middle class. We build home ownership, not just for high-income folks, across the board. We could come back to that. I think we will come back to that. So home ownership is a big piece. It's still the American dream. People still aspire to that. And I think that can come back. We can talk details if you'd like in Q&A. I think that this movement in Congress has actually been a movement towards a consensus that we can get to. But we need help for rental. And the help for rental with some proven policies you all know that have worked. We need more funding for them, but they're proven. And then we are going to need to do new emphasis on land trusts and versions of land trusts and getting housing and land that we're going to be able to move towards inclusionary housing in cities where we don't have today affordability problems that get more severe. Not just only a question for people being able to live in communities with good public goods, but also it will become a problem for the community themselves to have right there at hand the first responders. And we see that happening already in places like New York, which recognize the problem. They're not, Mayor de Blasio, of course, is doing this in part for providing housing for all, but also it's a self-interested move because you need police, you need fire, you need teachers in the city, and you need to have affordable housing.
Wow. Well, I'm looking forward to coming back to that on Q&A. So Jeremy, we've been hearing a lot at the conference around the reduced role of the federal government in supporting a number of initiatives, and so that requires a lot of the local governments who are also experiencing declines in their tax base and additional pressures to provide more response to a lot of these community development issues. One other area beyond that and helping these communities to maintain their infrastructure, so I want you to kind of look at that part, but also maybe talk a little bit about schools. So over the last day and a half, we've heard a lot about new models for schools, and it seems as if, at least in my own community, school choice can be a bad word and it can also be a good word. So I'm curious about your perspective and where you see the trend and what are some of the necessary components that we'll need in order for us to think about developing successful educational systems as well.
Let me start off with the schools one because it's not a hot button issue, so I'd like to talk about it. So, in general, since this is a panel on the future, in general, I would make as a political statement, and this isn't about this city or this country or true everywhere. In general, the past is better organized than the future, right? So it's the institutions of the past, of past practices, particularly in the public sector and to a certain extent in civil society, that exert a great amount of influence and sometimes help enable the future and sometimes hold it back or less than flexible. And so in local education, I think what's really curious is you have a kind of industrial, it's local because almost all of our money for education comes locally, but you have a kind of an industrial corporate command and control model, which really came out of the 1920s, 1930s, when the high school, in essence, was created. And then you have an agrarian calendar, right? And that just keeps playing out as if the world hasn't changed, which is really curious. And then on the other hand, you have, and then in fact you have work practices and ways of thinking about training and ways of thinking about the way you would organize your work that actually have emerged during that period, right? And, monopolies, no matter what kind of monopoly, whether it's somebody in software, they don't change if they don't have to. If they have the monopoly, they're, thank you. This is not just a public issue. It's certainly true in the private sector. They change when they have to change, when they're being pushed to change. At the same time, in education, you have an enormous amount of I would say, some of the most exciting research globally and in America relates to education right now. The neuroscience work, cognitive work, what we've learned about the brain. And I'd say some of the most exciting things in technology, and you can see the incredible investments that are being made in technology in education. So we have a very, very funny pattern. On the one hand, we have local systems from a different era that are trying to figure out how to change. We have accelerating research and techniques, in part through technology, in part because we're learning more about how it is people learn, and in fact, how to customize learning for people. You read Clay Christensen's work and many others on this. Our own Angela Duckworth here in Philadelphia has done such outstanding work on the non-cognitive aspects of education. And we're having a hard time getting these two, the institutional and the sort of analytical, together. So one belongs to some extent to the past, but doesn't have to, and one belongs, I think, a bit more to the future. So that's the 10,000, feet view where you don't get into too much trouble. So now let me come down and get into some more trouble. My own sense is that we're in a transition period right now, and we're in a transition period where the monopoly is breaking apart. And this is not only true in the public school systems, but it is true in the archdiocese systems and the Catholic schools. We're watching these incredible transformations that are happening there. And they're breaking apart because customers are not so happy with the product. And if you're not happy with the product, you opt out, or you try to create a different product, or you look for policies that will allow you to create new products. And so we're slowly moving, and I know this is, for reasons I can't figure out, a bad word, we're slowly moving toward a portfolio management perspective, although I think not as well defined as I would like, where the wisest thing for cities to do is to have a perspective that I am agnostic in form, but I am not agnostic in outcomes. So whether something is district-run, charter-run, contract-run, that's not the issue, as long as you can mate within the perspective of financial sustainability. But we have to be able to judge the outcomes, and there's lots of controversy around the best way to judge it, but not impossible, in my view, to get to that. And then what we have to be willing to do is to make decisions around the scaling up or the cutting back, no matter what the form is, whether it's district, charter, or whatever. And if we do that, we will generate a set of options where the public sector becomes not only the manager of schools, but more importantly, the quality-based, value-based regulator, where they will help figure out what you scale up and bring down. But they have to be able to do that with having an ethical commitment to the future and not an institutional commitment to the past. Now, it's much easier to say that than to do that, because people are organized around what they know. And in that way, they're often organized around a past that will do them no good. And here we have problems both from the ideologues on the left and the ideologues on the right. The ideologues on the left view the realm of freedom only in the public sector, and if you change work rules, then somehow you've got this terrible thing that's happened, just don't know what that is. And then the ideologues on the right think choice in and of itself will somehow get you to quality. Well, there's lots of reasons to be suspicious of that. Most Americans are much more pragmatic than either of those two. And what they'd like to do is come up with a redefined system of qualities that would allow us to experiment and would allow us to create the guardrails for quality and performance, and where the conversation would be less about ideology and would be much more about America's future. Until we get to that, we're going to have a hard time.
Okay.
And I will get off my soapbox.
Great job with that. And this next question kind of builds on this, and this is, admittedly, it's a bit provocative, and that has to do with, is revitalization an option for all communities, or is this something that, with the level of investment that will be required to revitalize? So we've talked a little bit about Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Detroit and Baltimore, which we see how revitalization has impacted those communities in a positive way. But when we look at some other more challenged cities, particularly those that may not have the types of assets that you might find in these major cities. So part of the discussion is the assumption that all communities kind of deserve to be revitalized. But I'm curious about your perspectives about the level of investment that will be required in order to reform things to address issues around infrastructure and schools and to create jobs and to attract companies and to develop an entrepreneurial environment. That's a lot of work. So, and we've seen many of these communities lose population. So is it worth the investment to kind of assume that all communities should be the targets for revitalization efforts?
Well, just let me take quickly that simple question. Let's take out the word community. Should all cities of every size at any place be preserved? Of course not. I mean, we have cities across the whole Great Plains that have been losing population because, and that's where the most loss has been, because these are small agricultural towns and old manufacturing towns, and there's no need for them. So in fact, as I think we now have the agreement here, there's been a movement to metropolitan areas and cities and suburbs and small cities in metropolitan areas. But that said, I think your question has a somewhat different spin on it, which is you're using the word not cities, but, and we don't have any commitment to specific necessarily places, although of course historic places, there is some commitment, culture, there's some commitment, but it's to people. And but you use the word communities, and I think you're referring to communities who are really at this point, because in part they're segregated. In terms of Raj Chetty's point, segregation turns out to be a huge indicator of lack of prospects of social mobility, not only for people of color, but for white people as well. So across the board, it's these areas where there's a lack of social mobility. So these areas, and I know you are in Atlanta, and your area includes Appalachia and the huge South, and you look at Raj Chetty's maps, that's where all the indicators are red and lack of mobility. But the options may be more difficult, I don't doubt it, but there's also an imperative. And not only that, it seems to me that besides the imperative, this is where there is the most gains possible. So here is where we have America most left behind. And there is where, if we are going to address problems of health, obesity, education, we may be the most difficult, but it is the most important. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but I think it's just simply not an option to ignore these huge part of the United States. And that said, there are successful examples. And you know, who knew I was say this? Texas. I mean, Texas is an area, whoa, you know, that I admire and comment about Texas, but there is in fact mobility
Sure.
And Texas has
That's very well.
majority minority. So there are lessons that we can learn. It's not by any means hopeless.
Well, I mean, I'd go so far to your question, do we owe something to all communities? I'd go so far as to say we need to facilitate a graceful exit from communities that don't have an asset or two. And that has lots of different dimensions to it. I mean, one obvious dimension is all the legacy liabilities that these communities have. I mean, people worked as firemen, as teachers and police, and there's pension funds, and so we're not obviously very graceful at given the Detroit example and other examples that will come in the future. We don't have a systematic way of thinking about how to address that problem. Another dimension of it is all the blighted, vacant properties that exist in a lot of these communities. Philadelphia is a good case in point, but they're in all these communities, and they're a real problem, and we're not very good at trying to figure out how to address that as a problem and an issue. So I think actually we should be spending some energy on how do we gracefully exit out. And this is going to become more of an issue for us in the future because the nation's population growth is slowing, right? And this is a real problem in other economies across the world. You go to Japan or go to Germany, their populations are declining, and they're grappling with this issue. How do I mean, schools are empty and communities are emptying, hollowing out. How do I manage this shrinking of the size of my population? Now, we're fortunately not in that kind of situation. We have immigration and our population is going to continue to grow, but it's not going to grow like it has in the past, and it's going to grow a lot more slowly, even with immigration reform. And so we need to be thinking more, I think, in a consistent way with regard to how do we do this in a graceful way?
Okay.
I mean, I just would add, I agree with my colleagues. I would just add, I think that question, to me, I would answer that question by asking the question for us, what's our social contract with people more than with a particular place? And there's been a lot of conversation over the last 20 or 30 years and a lot written about how the old social contract that maybe we thought of in the 50s, 60s, and 70s has been changed, and that we need to rethink it given the nature of markets and changing global conditions. But I think the social contract has to include the management of some of these legacy issues, right, that we're talking about. But that doesn't mean the social contract has to in some way, and first of all, social contract is reciprocal. The nature of a social contract means there's got to be reciprocal behavior on two sides with people and places. It doesn't mean that every place and every institution has to be preserved, particularly if in fact they didn't do what they needed to do for their preservation. I'm here with two great economists, and I'm not an economist, but one of the things I learned from economists early on was the concept of, I guess it came out of the insurance industry, of moral hazard. And there's a great deal of moral hazard when you save things that will come back and with the same problem over and over again because they didn't change behavior. The EU wonders about this with Greece, I suppose. But this is this kind of question. I do think having an explicit social contract in these ways, where there is kind of a reciprocal sense through that contract, I think is important in all ways.
So I'm going to go to the audience in just a moment, but I want to follow up just on this question around economic mobility. So beyond the information that we saw from Professor Teddy, Angela Blackwell also talked about issues related to segregation, and certain populations seem to be experiencing a lot of these challenges, even more so. For example, we heard from the superintendent here in Philadelphia who talked about African American students and minority populations having a less than 50% graduation rate. In Milwaukee, we heard that unemployment among African American males was about 50%. So, and then we also heard that maybe some targeted approaches might be what needs to happen. So I'm curious about what we might expect in the future to help to address not only issues around that particular population, but economic mobility in general. So is raising the minimum wage, is that one aspect that will help to address that? But also, are there also additional targeted approaches that you view, in your view, might help to begin to address some of these challenges?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I don't think the minimum, just to explicitly answer the question on the minimum wage, I don't think that goes to mobility. It's very small in the grand scheme of things. And there's a lot of legitimate debate about the net benefit to lower working income people. I think on net it is a positive, but it's not a slam dunk positive, and it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. So I wouldn't count on that as being very helpful in the context of this very, very big problem. I mean, I think it's now hackneyed, but I think it's so true, is the answer to mobility, I think, is going back to the middle income occupations getting hollowed out and where those people go, is raising their skill and educational attainment. I mean, bottom line, our economy we're competing globally, right? And this is just every day, the global competition is intensifying. And for people like the people in the room, the three of us up here, this is a boon, right? I mean, now I have people that are building models that the European banks are using in their stress testing, or the Chinese central bank is using. So globalization has enhanced the returns to what I do, and the world is my oyster, really. And then for people who have no skills, they're just, they're getting crushed because they're competing against low-wage labor all across the country, across the world. So this dynamic is firmly in place, and really the only obvious way for us is to raise the educational attainment of the population. So it's very hackneyed. I'll just make one other point, and then I'll stop. And it maybe goes to some other themes that have been running through the conference. To address the problem of educational attainment and workforce development, we need better data and information. I'll give you one example of that. My gut tells me, and it's only a gut because I have no data, and I could be wrong, but that doesn't stop me from saying it, that it's businesses that spend more resources, dollars, on developing their workforce, much more than we spend in the public context in terms of schools and education. It's enormous, and we don't know how big that is. We don't know how that's changing over time, and unless we get a better grip on that, I don't think we can address this problem in a holistic way. And my gut also tells me that the amount of resources, energy, finances, business people, and I say this as a business person, I have 125 employees, 75 economists all across the globe, so I live this every day. I think we're spending less on workforce development in our companies, and the reason is people are more footloose than they were before. That social contract between the employer and employee has changed, and so now if I invest in my people, I don't get the return on investment that I did historically because they leave and it's gone. I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm saying that's the reality of what's happening, and that's affecting how much we're investing in our people. And we don't know how big a problem that is because we have absolutely, as far as I know, there is no data at all on this topic. So, this is something we need to get much better information on, I think, before we are going to be able to address it in a clear, consistent, holistic way.
So I think that's absolutely right, that there has been a move away from one job throughout one's life, and one gets skilled in that job over time by the direct knowledge from the firm. And because of that break, it used to be you could have a high school education, or years and years ago you could have an education which wasn't even high school, get a job in manufacturing and just have a living wage. But that's not happening anymore, and getting that first job where you can then be educated by your company and by simply the process of the job itself That's hard. And I think there is no other solution than addressing the education system. And we have M. Night Shyamalan's talk yesterday. It has to be addressed in a all-inclusive, intense, and just as we heard from Jeremy, it's not about the form, it's about the outcome. And we have to be ruthless in supporting schools that, in fact, result in successful outcomes. You know, you hear a statistic like we heard from Superintendent Height yesterday, that 50% of African American boys don't graduate. It's heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking that it hasn't changed. And without that, there isn't that first job where you can get educated. There isn't that potential. So we need to solve that problem. And I think we heard of ways, and I think we know of ways. And I think it's actually, to some degree, happening, but we simply have to speed that up. And Mark said something which I think is really important too, which is we need to reestablish, this is on a national level, we need to reestablish that connectivity in a different way of learning over the life cycle in the job and that initial connection directly to jobs. Germany does this well. Yeah. This connectivity between high-skilled manufacturing, apprenticeship work. It isn't necessarily about being so well-defined in a narrow job. It's about getting the basic skills that you can apply first to the narrow job. And we have some examples, Siemens was raised, of that done successfully. I think we need to do that far more so that there is a route, not only that works, but that brings hope back, that you can see that it does work. And I think I don't think it's going to be so impossible, because once we see these routes in place that work and see more of the success, it's self-reinforcing. And once you see the hope and that it does work, people do take heart and put their own energies and efforts. You know, that said, it's already happening, and people in this room are already doing it. So I think we shouldn't be only disheartened. I think we should look to what is happening because of the, in fact, brave steps some people have taken and courage and push for change. And Jeremy, you've been at the front of that.
Third row. I would say I agree wholeheartedly with what Susan and Mark have said. I would just add to skills, your question about social mobility and the Chetty work that related to social isolation or segregation is really important. And one of the great things about cities, if they're working and they're thriving and they're growing, that some cities in the last 20 years have rediscovered public life in a new way. They've rediscovered how to become places where public spaces are really diverse in terms of use and people. If I get, as a Philadelphian, if I'm really pessimistic, which happens, occasionally, then I'll go to the Reading Terminal Market on a Saturday, where people from every walk of life are. Or I'll go not too far from here to Franklin Square, where on a spring day, every imaginable person is. And so one of the things we've learned in the last 20 or 30 years, in many ways we've learned a little bit of the lessons of Jane Jacobs, that we've got to reconstitute public life. And that's a piece of, it's also got to be related to inclusionary housing and inclusionary zoning for sure. But it is not a small step. It's very, very important to rediscover that. Now, skills, of course, because skills and income and given globalization. I would say one other thing which is hard to talk about in some ways, which is that if you have low workforce skills, and you're just trying to make it and trying to build your skills as you go. Particularly if you have children, it is very difficult to do that with one income in the household. And so while everybody should marry who they want or not get married or whatever, I was once on a panel where somebody said, I just wanted everybody to be married because I was miserable, but that wasn't true. But the truth is that just doing the math, it's really difficult with one one income if you have low skills to get out of poverty, even with the transfer, even with the social wage that you can get from food stamps and the like. And so I do think we've got to be willing to face the math and be willing to talk about that in the same way that we have to face the math about student outcomes. And this isn't because I think everybody should get married or again. There are good reasons not to. There are good reasons to have families of all different kinds or to get divorced. I just want to say the math says this about what the prospects are for two-income families of a certain income, of a certain workforce skill versus a one-income family of that workforce skill, and what the prospects are. We should know that. We should not pretend otherwise. And I think that's important. So if I'm not going to get in trouble for the education thing I said, now I'm in trouble for families or something.
Well, we'll go to our audience for questions now, and certainly I probably have a question on that one. But so what we'll do is if you'll just say who you are and what organization you represent, and we'll also encourage you to keep your questions to a question, and if you can just quickly kind of get to that. And I know I get criticized sometimes when I'm asked to do this. Questions, remember, they start with the 5 W's or the H. So if that's not one of the first things that you say, then rethink your comment. But if you'll go ahead.
It's tough.
Hi, good morning. Robin Hackey, formerly of Living Cities. There's a growing fascination in the philanthropic and community development worlds with job creation. And I'm wondering if the panel can say whether there actually is anything that cities, communities, philanthropies can do that creates jobs as opposed to moving them around, or is it really just about the human capital and the workforce investment?
Anything that philanthropic organizations can do? Or
Cities.
Okay, all right. Okay, so going back to where I started with the tale of two cities, which I firmly believe, larger cities, they should be and I'm thinking about this in the context of promoting jobs and growth. They should be focused on improving the inputs into the production process, infrastructure.
Yeah.
I got to have good roads. And goodness knows I need better roads where I live. Yeah. Telecommunication infrastructure, airports, all those kinds of things, seaports and so forth. The educational system. Don't pick winners and losers. Don't focus on this institution or that institution. It's all about lowering the cost of doing business and living in your geography. And it's a field of dreams kind of strategy. You do these things, they will come. And they will come. And the marketplace will figure out what should come. For smaller communities, and when I say smaller, I'm talking about the Altoonas of the world, the Eries of the world. They're too small. They're small. There's no economies of scale. They've got these demographic headwinds in their face. They should be, in my view, to promote jobs, they've got to identify what is it that makes this economy tick. What is my asset? What are my assets if I have one or two or three? And then I'd be focused like a laser beam. I'd be in the CEO's office. I'd be in the CFO's office, or whatever it may be, and saying, what is it that you need to make your life better, easier, and for you to expand your operations here? It could be a university. A lot of these towns have universities, Penn State satellite campus or whatever it may be. And also, if this may be, I may get into trouble, but if I, all these things I'm saying, I'm saying it with a broad brush, right? I mean, obviously it depends community to community. There's no one answer for every place. But if I were in one of these smaller communities, I'd be much less focused on my K through 12. You know why? Because you educate the K through 12, they're gone. They're gone. They're out of there. They're not sticking around. I assure you, they're coming to Philly. They're going to D.C. They're really good. They're going to be in San Jose. So I'd be focused on my community college, university, you invest in those things, you bring in professors and teachers, and they're going to care about their kids and their education, and they'll worry about K through 12. So it's a very different kind of strategy, I think, depending on what community you're talking about. And this actually works regionally, too. So a very well-developed economy like California should be taking the cost of production strategy. If I were sitting in Mississippi or Alabama, I'd be taking, and to some degree they do, right? I mean, they focus on how am I going to get the Mercedes-Benz plant to locate in Huntsville, Alabama. That's the right strategy. And I wouldn't be focused on K through 12. I'd be focused on Ole Miss and, University of Alabama and all those kinds of things. So the same kind of dichotomy I just argued at a city level, I'd also do in a broader regional level as well. So but again, it's a very broad brush. Like Lancaster, PA, very different, than Erie's prospects for lots of different reasons. And so you might not take the same kind of strategy I articulated for Erie.
Okay. Why don't we take this question here?
So I'm Jeff Hornstein from the Philadelphia City Controller's Office. This may sound like I'm bound by what the great philosopher called the dead ideas of the past, but I'd like to float two of them out there for consideration, sort of riffing on what Mark just said. What are our assets here in Philadelphia? We have 22 universities in town. We have 10 hospitals, $14 billion operating budget, $5.5 billion in procurement spending a year. A lot of that can be localized. So the first dead idea of the past I'd like to raise here is import substitution on the local level, working to coordinate purchasing power among those eds and meds anchor institutions to create local jobs. And the second idea I'd raise, and it seems to be ignored in these conversations, which is odd, because there's no such thing as an inherently badly paying job. Wages are a function of market power, and the way American workers have tended to build market power is through collective bargaining. In this town, we can look at the recent example of 2,000 new security officers joining a union, raising their wages by tens of millions of dollars, and flowing into some of the most poorest communities in the city. So if I were a city father, I would be looking at import substitution and facilitating union organizing among the service sector, which is the bottom, which doesn't inherently have to be the bottom. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as economists.
Yes, the economists.
Well, I thought you stayed in a Holiday Inn last night.
I did.
Yeah. So you could be anything you want this morning.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Does anybody get that joke?
Yeah.
All right. I've used that before and people don't laugh. I mean, to me, that's really funny.
I think it was more of a statement. May I go back to the last question, however? I think actually the production of communities that provide affordable housing with quality of life, public goods, is actually a job promoter as well.
Sure.
So in that sense, K through 12 does matter because actually people are moving to cities where they maybe commute a half hour, whether to small cities, they commute to the next city out, because that place has affordable housing, quality of life, K through 12 education, and it's not only, of course, it works for that town. It also, of course, works for the country, just as we heard from Raj Chetty. It's the Iowas of the world who do this well, who maybe people leave them, but then it works for the country. So, but I want to say something very specific to that question, which is Tim Bartik's session with others coming right at 10 o'clock has very specific answers to what towns and cities can do in terms of job creation. So you'll learn more there.
So, but you asked the import substitution question, right? Is that it? I was just curious. There is this artisanal and maker community world that's emerging and self-organizing, and in some cities it has real, it's got real traction. But you're talking about picking winners by saying, I assumed what he meant, picking winners by saying, we buy this and therefore we can do it locally. I don't know that that's ever worked very well.
There is certainly the anchor institutions putting
Sure.
more energy into buying local, creating firms, supporting the development of new enters who increase competition. Where the economy's
I'm predisposed to say I don't like that idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think our future is in hugging the rest of the world as hard as possible because that's where the energy is going to come from. That's where the ideas and innovation are going to come. We want the best and the brightest from all over the world to come here, and the way to do that is to trade with them. And some things they're going to do really well, some things we're going to do really well, and we're going to all be better off by doing those things. And so I'm not saying not to buy local. I'm not saying that, but that's if that's the mindset, I think that's the wrong mindset.
Yeah, and I think there's the tendency in that to create artificial monopolies, right, sort of locally, that are guarded, and I just ultimately that will fall apart. So
but you can train locally to create competition, actually.
Absolutely.
With the non-local.
Okay. Interesting debate.
Was that a debate?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think there are a lot of...
that was not a debate, Todd.
There are
He's trying to cause a problem. That was not a debate.
Okay.
Well,
all right, we'll take the next question, please.
Sir, let's see if we can shift the conversation a little bit. Joe Schilling with the Metropolitan Institute of Virginia Tech. My question's about the future structure of local governments. So first disclaimer is I worked for local government. I've taught local government law. I'm a supporter of local government. But if we are looking 20 or 30 years down the future, I was connecting Jeremy's thoughts about school districts being sort of arcane and out of date. It seems our structure of local government's the same. And I wanted to connect that with Mark's idea about, well, gracefully exiting. So how do we take smaller cities and, I don't know, amortize them out over a period of 10 years or 5 years? I mean, you know, without the politics, just from a policy perspective, I mean, one, do we need to do that? And two, how do we do it?
Right. You take a crack at it, Joe?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. So there are obviously a lot of layers to what I think is an excellent and timely question. And one subtext of that question is we're not very good at receivership for places that are not working. And we're probably, sadly, going to have to figure out how to get a lot better at receivership by states. So that I would just sort of put that in there. Secondly, I would say that, you know, if I used the government reform language of 30 years ago, I would say that governments have to learn that they don't always have to be the rower. They can sometimes be the steerer and don't have to row. And that means that governments have to be prepared to function, in my view, at a different, higher level of governance, not as the doer, but as the manager of the outcome of the good and the oversight in terms of its quality and its cost effectiveness. And I think in an era when there's much less public subsidy, that governments that will do better are governments, and when governments are trying to deal with deferred liabilities, not just pension and health care, but deferred maintenance on infrastructure, this search for how do we maintain qualities and at the same time do it in a cost-effective way is, I think, going to force a lot of governments to think of themselves as the hub of a very complex supply chain and not as a vertically constructed organism that every time it has to do a function adds another program or a department, right? So if you think about what's happened in the private sector over the last 30 or 40 years, even, and this doesn't have to do with the accumulation of capital or of power, but the supply chains have become really complex about how you get things done. And there's a certain horizontal character to it. And so people have gotten good at managing that as opposed to managing the unitary corporate entity in the way that they did 30 or 40 years ago. So I would say because of a set of pressures that we have on local government, that those governments that will do better are governments that will rethink vertical management versus horizontal management. I'm being simplistic, but just to use that as a metaphor. And I think more broadly, this question of receivership, how do we do it better, The federal government does it by taking over a particular department, a housing authority or something else. States sometimes do it by taking over departments, but usually they do it when the government can no longer meet obligations. There's a problem with the bond. They back the bond. They give them a little technical assistance. Sometimes there isn't a lot of money. In an extreme case, they move toward bankruptcy, which we just had the largest municipal bankruptcy ever in Detroit, 4 times larger than the one that was in Alabama some years ago. I think this is something, sadly, we're going to have to get better at. So I would just throw those ideas out.
So I think there was an implication in that question, Joe, tell me if I'm wrong, that local governments in some ways, or reliance on local governments in this country, is archaic, it's going away. I agree with everything that Jeremy said, but I'm taking it in a slightly different direction, which is, I disagree. I think local governments are actually the heart of our success in this country. It's the diversity, it's the competition, it's the federalism, it's the pulling up of the success stories of social entrepreneurs, mayors across the chair that learn from each other and also that learn from the failures. And I don't think that's going anywhere. I think actually other countries, and from a world perspective involved with the World Urban Campaign, and actually the big push is to more local control. Because it's on the local level that you have the customers that you're delivering education, public safety, and that's where you're going to get the feedback, that's where you're going to get the accountability, and that is a secret of our delivery in general of good outcomes. However, big caveat and reversal here, which is the future is, I believe, in America, hopefully, needfully, and we've begun to see the beginnings of this, to regional perspective. And there needs to be cooperation on the local governments, especially because poverty pockets now are, poverty is greater in suburbs in terms of absolute numbers, in suburban, small cities, et cetera, than in inner ring suburbs than it is in cities. We're going to need to see that cooperation across the board. We're going to need the regional perspective, just as we heard from Manuel Pastor in the first plenary. That regional perspective vision is going to be necessary. We're going to need to have a combination of entrepreneurship on the local level and cooperation for delivery of public goods.
I want to follow up on that question just because I'm curious about how you actually do that. Because in my area, I think there's been a push toward more regional approaches, but this idea of local control is important. The problem is that many of the local jurisdictions don't have the resources that some of the more affluent areas might have. So, for example, if you take a region like in Atlanta, I'm sure this is true in Pennsylvania as well, then there's this mentality of I only want to pay for the things that impact my specific community and not necessarily the region, even though we have a regional labor market and we operate regionally. So how do we address some of those trends? I guess this is for any of you.
Well, that's a lot driven by the way we raise money for local public goods, right? We have a tax system that is hyper-local for many goods, which is different than it is in other countries, say the way France raises money or distributes money for education versus us. So I think I agree with Susan in the following way, that an understandable reaction, and perhaps a positive reaction, to globalization is to want to maintain and deepen local connectivity, including local democracy, and I think that makes sense. The question is when you have these disparate ways that or ways that I think can be quite problematic about the way tax policy works, does that become problematic? Now, it does, and of course the role traditionally was that either the federal government would create minimum standards or the states would create minimum standards, or the state in the role in education and other things would be the redistributive agent. Then the question becomes, how effective is the state as the redistributive agent between localities that have more or less taxing capacity? So I agree in a normative sense, and I think what we've got to still address in that is the issue of redistribution further up the federalist chain. And yeah, so I'll stop with
And
that.
it's the I agree, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the intersection of states and metropolitan areas. So states need to be empowering their regions to deal with the variety of resources that each individual component has, and also the overall future of the region. Part of that is, to use Manuel Pastor's phrase, the epistemic view of we are one region. Some regions have done this better, we can learn, and the states need to learn how to support this regional view. I think we do this very poorly in Pennsylvania, by the way, and I think we can learn from other states.
Okay.
Hi, Steve Burrington with Groundwork USA. I'd like to press you on the question of communities, maybe even more of a can of worms than education, in a sense. I take Roz Chetty's research to show that communities do matter, that the prospects of a kid differ depending on whether he's growing up in an isolated a neighborhood or a community that is more integrated economically and otherwise. And yet, I think it's a lot easier to talk about things like how maybe there's no hope for cities of 200,000 to 300,000 and graceful exits and whatnot when it comes to communities than it is to say comparable things about education. I mean, we expect all schools to meet a certain standard. We're raising those standards. And we seem to have, although you were starting to get into it now, I'd like to ask you to go a little bit farther into it. We seem to have less clarity about how we bring the communities where kids are growing up to a certain minimum level. And I don't think we want to say that that's just a completely hopeless endeavor and we're going to have to fly people around the country and put them in new communities. So could I ask you to speak to the question of what community building should look like so that it produces the kinds of outcomes that Roz Chetty seems to be saying that that more integrated communities can produce.
So who are you addressing that to? That
well, I'll
question.
start with you.
Okay.
Since you talked
Because you
about
said you, and I'm not sure who you is.
Graceful exits.
Yeah.
It's really to any of you.
Well, let me clarify a little bit with regard to my comments about graceful exit from smaller communities of a couple, 300,000. What I'm proposing is that it's more of a, the question was really addressed to how do I generate more jobs, which I think is ultimately key to everything. Without jobs, nothing works. So then the question is, well, how do I create more jobs? And my point was that for large cities, it's more of a bottom-up kind of approach. Let's make the ground fertile and let 1,000 flowers bloom. For smaller communities, it's more of a top-down approach. Find the flower in your community and water it, fertilize it, and hopefully it creates other flowers. I'm not saying give up. I'm not saying that. It's just a strategy, a different approach and strategy. And you have to make hard choices. Like I said, if I were in that smaller community, I would be less focused on K through 12 directly. I care about K through 12, and I think that's vitally important. But I think the way to address the problem is fertilize the flower, create more flowers, create more jobs, create more tax revenue. And by the way, if you bring in educated people that are in the flower, I assume everyone understands. I'm really stretching this.
Yeah.
It's working.
The metaphor is
working, all
still
right.
good.
Yeah. If you bring me into, if you create a job for me in Erie, Pennsylvania, me, Mark Zandi, and I go to Erie, Pennsylvania, I tell you what, I'm going to be really focused on how to educate my 3 kids. I'm going to spend enormous resources. I'm going to be in that school system. I'm going to be thinking about charter
And that's in part
schools.
how you're going to choose that community.
Yeah, customer demand.
Well, I mean, no. Well, if it's the job, if it's the flower, and the guy says, come be my chief economist and run the world.
But it's the
you're
job
going.
in the metro area. You can commute. You can choose.
Not to
and you're
Erie.
No.
Not
But
to
he's saying,
Altoona.
but what Mark's saying is that customer or citizen demand is a huge driver of change.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
if you tip the nature at a certain point, as you kind of mix up the customers and and as you do that, then they will be the drivers of change. And I do think we have a tendency to think that big policies will be the drivers of change, and occasionally they are. But we forget that it's customers and citizens that are the drivers of change.
And local public goods are going
Absolutely.
to attract population.
Yeah,
Part of the things that cities
exactly.
deliver, jobs sine qua non, but they also deliver housing
Sure.
in communities with education, family-friendly neighborhoods. That's also a good that's being delivered.
Yeah, but here, look, so Philly, I'd be all about the parks. I'd be all about the amenities. In Erie, my focus would not be on the parks. I'd go find that asset, and I'm all about that asset, because that asset's going to create the revenue that I can make the parks.
So
but focusing on the parks, you're never going to, that's not going to keep those kids there. They're going to go to Philly.
So
They're going to go to
actually,
Pittsburgh.
I think, and I can't envision Erie itself, but focus,
You should go visit,
yes.
by the way. They have a great hotel
Do they have
on Lake Erie, and that's an asset, by the way.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Lake Erie, which has some beautiful amenities, perhaps a park is what your memory is. And, it's not either or. I think that's a wrong opposition. It's not either or. You can have someone focusing on the schools, that's their job. Someone focusing on the parks, that's their job. We should have good schools. We should have greenery parks. It's not a small, it's not such a impossible
All right, now this is a
outcome.
debate. This is a debate.
Right. No, this is a debate that I
Well,
love.
it's a scarce goods debate, right? So if you have scarce resources, and your job is
No, but
that.
there's a reinforcing. If you do deliver, then in fact the property tax
Yes.
rates, tax ratables will go up. We can create good communities.
Well,
in fact, we are.
I'd love to continue this debate, but we just had we had the flicker of lights, because I guess the part that I'd add is that who are people empowered? Who's going to make these choices? And I mean, so who's going to contribute to making the decisions when it's the assumption that the people under your scenario are typically probably going to be the higher income people who are coming to that community. But how do we empower those people who are more vulnerable in terms of them being part of the conversation and planning? And I don't necessarily think we've done a good job of that. I think there's an opportunity for us as community developers to play a bigger role in that. So with that, please join me in thanking this great panel. So what I'd like for each person to do is I'll remind you about your evaluations. They are very important to the conference organizers, so if you'll please make sure to complete that for the day and for the session and drop it off at the front. And now you'll head on to your next session, and we'll convene back here for lunch later in the day.